Scars are just another kind of medal. There are places in this world where silence is sacred. Hospital corridors at midnight, the space between salutes at a soldier's funeral, and oddly enough, the chow hall at Fort Breyer, on a crisp morning, thick with the tang of iron and pine. The new batch of Army recruits sat stiffly on the long metal benches, their trays trembling in their hands, not because of the cold but because of her. She wasn't tall, she didn't wear a uniform with rank on her collar or ribbons on her chest. In fact, she didn't even wear boots that made noise when she walked, but every step she took echoed like thunder. Her name, at least the only one the recruits knew her by, was Miss Grace. No rank, no last name, just Miss Grace, and her face told stories that made grown men swallow hard and avoid her eyes. She was silent most of the time. She didn't shout like the drill sergeants. She didn't bark commands or break clipboards over her knee. But something about her presence twisted the air around her. You felt it before you saw it, like a storm about to break. Every recruit had heard of her before stepping foot on base. Some claimed she was a legend. Others swore she was just a rumor exaggerated into myth. Some said she used to be a sniper. Others whispered tales about her carrying 3 wounded soldiers out of a burning Humvee under fire. But all of them noticed the same thing: the scars. One thick line dragged from the corner of her lip to her jaw. Another, longer and crueler, curled from the edge of her neck down into her collar. And those were just the ones you could see. Recruits didn't ask questions. They stared when they thought she wasn't looking and quickly dropped their eyes when she turned. Except for one. Private First Class Ethan Breyer was the kind of soldier you'd expect to be cast in a recruitment. Commercial, blonde, square-jawed, loud, and self-assured to the point of arrogance. His family had served in the military for generations. His grandfather stormed Normandy. His father was a colonel. He wore his family's legacy like a badge, convinced it gave him an edge over every other person in his unit. So when Miss Grace walked past their table that day, Ethan nudged his buddy and chuckled just loud enough to be heard. Looks like someone lost a fight with a blender. The chuckle died almost immediately. The entire table froze. Miss Grace didn't flinch. She didn't turn. She simply stopped walking. The silence was deafening. The rest of the recruits stared at Ethan in horror, like children caught misbehaving in church. Then, from across the room, a voice barked, "Room, a 10 hut." The general had entered. Brigadier General Thompson was the kind of man you didn't see often, and certainly not during routine meal hours. He wore his age and medals with the same dignity, both earned, both carried heavily. As he strode in, flanked by 2 colonels, even the sergeants straightened. He made a beeline for Miss Grace. "Good morning, warrant officer," he said with a nod. Ethan's head snapped so fast it could have broken his neck. "Warrant officer?" Miss Grace returned the general's nod with only a respectful "sir." Then General Thompson turned to the recruits, his eyes landing on Ethan like a missile system locking target. "I hear someone here had something to say about one of our finest." Ethan swallowed. "Private First Class Breyer," the general said, voice calm, measured, but carrying the kind of weight that pressed the breath from your lungs. "Do you know what her call sign used to be?" Ethan said nothing. His throat felt full of sand. The general didn't wait. Her call sign was Phoenix, because every time she burned, she came back stronger. The scar on her face, shrapnel from a secondary IED that went off after she'd already cleared the zone. She stayed behind to save 2 engineers. The one on her neck, close-range knife fight during an ambush, she took out all 4 insurgents. You mock her scars, boy, but you couldn't last 5 seconds in the fire she's crawled through. The mess hall was silent, not the kind of silence from earlier, but something deeper, reverent. Miss Grace gave a slight nod to the general, then turned and walked away, still silent, still unshaken. Ethan sat down slowly, the tray in front of him, now completely forgotten. That night, the whispers in the barracks weren't about her scars. They were about her stories, and suddenly, every scar on her body was a badge of honor that none of them could dare to earn. That night, Ethan didn't sleep, not because he was ashamed of being corrected, but because for the first time, he realized he had been born into a legacy while she had carved hers out with blood, steel, and fire. Legacy earned in silence. Ethan Breyer had grown up in a house lined with medals. His father's office was practically a shrine, an entire wall dedicated to family honor. Polished wooden frames held photographs of men in uniform, staring out stoically from the past, one in Vietnam, another in Desert Storm, and then his father in Afghanistan. There were medals, 2 silver stars, bronze stars, a purple heart that sat inside a glass case like a sacred relic. Ethan had walked through that office every day as a child, letting those symbols soak into his bones. He believed that one day his face would be up there too, not because he had done anything yet, but because he was a Breyer, and Breyers served. But at Fort Breyer, that name meant nothing. For the first time, he wasn't someone's son or someone's descendant. He was just another number, another shaved head in a sea of uniforms, struggling to keep up with the tempo of drill calls and ruck marches. After the incident in the Chow Hall, the air around Ethan had changed. His swagger didn't seem to fit anymore. His voice, once a loud and constant contributor to locker room banter, had quieted. People didn't sit next to him at meals as often, not because they hated him, but because they now saw something he hadn't seen himself. He was a kid playing soldier, not a soldier becoming a warrior. That night, he'd stared at the ceiling of the barracks for hours, unable to close his eyes. Miss Grace's scars haunted him not because of their appearance, but because of what they meant. They weren't just marks, they were proof of sacrifice, of endurance, of choosing the fire and surviving it. He kept replaying the general's words in his head. You couldn't last 5 seconds in the fire. She's crawled through. That one sentence cracked something inside him. The next morning came fast. Wake-up call at 0500, PT at 0530. Ethan pushed harder than he ever had. He ran until his lungs burned and his vision blurred. He ignored the cramps and dizziness, and when his squadmates asked if he was okay, he didn't joke or brag. He just nodded, breathless, and said, "I've got a lot to catch up on." But no matter how fast he ran, Miss Grace was already ahead. She wasn't even part of the training staff, at least not officially. She showed up only for the serious stuff: field exercises, close quarters drills, weapons malfunction protocols. And when she showed up, no one slacked off. The sergeants didn't have to shout. Her silence was enough. She moved like a shadow through the trees during nighttime field ops, appearing next to a recruit without a sound and pointing out their exposed flank, or poor stance with a quiet nod. She had an eye for weaknesses and a strange grace in how she corrected them, never with humiliation, only precision. During one particularly brutal ruck march through muddy forest rain, Ethan collapsed. His leg had cramped up halfway through the trail. The other recruits kept moving. Pushed forward by the drill sergeant's barks, Ethan clenched his jaw, refusing to cry out. But the pain in his thigh was unbearable. He tried to stand, but his leg refused. That's when she appeared. No sound, no announcement, just a figure kneeling next to him. Her face unreadable, out of breath. "Breyer?" she asked, her voice flat, but not unkind. Ethan blinked at her, stunned. "I just need a second." "Ma'am." She didn't respond. Instead, she extended a small black pouch and gestured for him to open it. Inside was a packet of salt tablets and an electrolyte shot. He swallowed them quickly, grateful but unsure why she had bothered. She helped him up, not with pity, but with a firm grip that reminded him she'd once carried grown men on her back through burning wreckage. As he steadied himself, she looked him in the eye. "You come from a family of soldiers." "That's not enough," she said. "Legacy isn't inherited, it's earned. Every scar on me, every one of them was bought with decisions I can't undo. Don't run from your weakness. Break it." And with that, she turned and walked away. Ethan stared at her retreating figure. The limp he'd imagined was there, born from rumors of old injuries, wasn't real. She walked as steady and strong as anyone on base, maybe stronger. There was no shame in her stride, no apology in her presence. The next day, Ethan stopped thinking of her as the woman with scars and started thinking of her as a teacher, a soldier, a leader. Weeks passed. His body toughened, his mind sharpened. He started listening not just to the commands, but to the lessons between them. The small things. How Miss Grace adjusted her footing when aiming in windy conditions. How she tied her boots slightly looser on night patrols for quicker removal. How she carried more trauma in her silence than any man he'd ever met carried in their words. Ethan began taking notes. After lights out, while others slept, he'd scribble observations in a small notebook. Not just about drills, but about how leadership looked when it wasn't postured. About how courage wasn't loud. About how scars could teach more than textbooks. One evening, during a final field simulation where recruits were paired for a mock extraction mission, Ethan's partner twisted his ankle in a steep ravine. The exercise was timed. Most would have called in a failure, ended the scenario, and moved on. But Ethan thought of Miss Grace and made a choice. He carried his partner through mud, through rocks, through thick underbrush. His lungs screamed. His shoulders ached. But he didn't stop. When they finally crossed the finish line, Sergeant Torres raised an eyebrow. "You know, you could have quit and just taken the penalty, right?" Ethan nodded. "I know, but that's not how Phoenix would have done it." The sergeant's eyes flickered for a second. "You're learning," he said quietly later that night. As the sun disappeared behind the hills and the air grew still, Ethan walked past the empty training field. Miss Grace was there, alone, inspecting the field layout. He didn't speak, not at first, but she turned, as if sensing him. "Breyer," she said, "you carried him." "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" "Because I figured if someone like you could carry wounded men through live fire, I could carry someone during a simulation." She studied him, face unreadable. Then, for the first time since his arrival, she smiled barely, but enough that he saw it. "You're starting to understand," she said, "but don't do it to impress anyone. Do it because when the real fire comes, there won't be time to decide who you wanted to be." And with that, she walked away again, leaving Ethan standing in the quiet, heart pounding, not from exertion, but from something deeper, something that felt like growth. In that moment, Ethan knew he'd remember her words long after basic training was over, long after his uniform changed color, long after he had children of his own to tell stories to. He didn't know yet that his real test was still coming, but he knew this much: he was no longer chasing legacy. He was earning his own. When the Fire Camp week they called Hell's March wasn't officially on the schedule. It wasn't in the boot camp orientation packet, and it sure wasn't mentioned during initial briefings. But every recruit heard about it. Whispers passed down from barracks to barracks, across generations of soldiers who had trudged through the same dust, breathed the same heat, and walked the same fire-scorched field where the Army tested more than muscle. They tested the soul. Ethan Breyer had been waiting for it. He knew Hell's March would come, just like every recruit before him. But knowing something is coming doesn't mean you're ready. And no one, not even those raised on legacy and medals, could truly prepare for the way Hell reshaped you. It started with a notice on the mess hall bulletin board: exercise code, Ember Path, gear loadout, full combat, report at 0400, duration 72 hours. That was it. No details, no hints. Just those simple lines that made every stomach twist, because everyone knew this was at the moment the Army tore down everything fake, every illusion of strength, and carved out whatever truth remained underneath. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He packed his gear twice, checked and rechecked his hydration kit, his rations, his sidearm. He remembered something Miss Grace once said during a weapons jam drill: "Real survival isn't about your weapon, it's about your will. If you rely on steel more than your spine, you'll break." Those words echoed louder than any gunshot. At 0400 sharp, the recruits gathered. 40 of them, boots thudding on dirt, breath visible in the morning chill. No one spoke. Even the usual chatterboxes were mute. The instructors didn't shout. They didn't need to. The silence was the scream. Then Miss Grace appeared, this time in uniform, full military fatigues, chest patch that read G. Winters, and a faded badge, Phoenix. No one had seen her in uniform before. It was like seeing a legend take form. Behind her stood General Thompson. His expression was unreadable. His voice, when he spoke, was low and steady. 3 days, no schedule, no comforts. You'll move as ordered, respond as commanded, and survive as trained. This isn't just an endurance test. This is where we find out who breaks and who becomes unbreakable. And then they moved. Day 1 was a forced march through steep terrain, with full packs 80 pounds on their backs and a fire in their lungs, up hills, down gullies, through streams so cold they felt like biting ice, across rough stone that tore at their boots and turned every step into pain. Ethan pushed forward. His legs screamed, his shoulders burned, and yet, somewhere in the middle of it all, something inside him clicked. He stopped counting the miles. He stopped comparing his pace to others. He focused on breathing, on staying present, on surviving each step. Miss Grace moved through the group like smoke, appearing next to struggling recruits and wordlessly pointing the way. She never yelled. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes said more than commands ever could. At one point, a recruit Mendoza collapsed from dehydration. While others hesitated, unsure whether to stop or continue, Miss Grace knelt beside him, administered first aid, rehydrated him, then carried his gear on her own shoulder for the next half mile without slowing down. Ethan saw it all, and it carved itself into him. By dusk, tents were set up near the base of a long ridge. The temperature dropped fast. They weren't allowed fires. They had to eat cold rations. Ethan sat with his squad under the shadow of a pine tree, watching his breath mist in the dark. He felt the blisters on his feet, the deep ache in his spine, but more than that, he felt the shift, something primal, something raw. This wasn't just a challenge anymore. It was becoming a crucible. Data came with simulated ambushes, loud explosives, smoke, blanks fired from hidden instructors dressed in enemy gear. They were tasked with locating an evac point through simulated hostile territory. Ethan's team was assigned rear guard. Their mission, defend the flank. It sounded simple, but by hour 6, when the fake gunfire rang out from the left, Ethan had to make a decision: hold the line or retreat. He didn't flinch. He ordered the teammates to fall back to a better position, covered their exit, and provided suppressive fire with his rifle. His heart was pounding so violently that he thought it might rupture, but he stayed put, didn't move, didn't let fear win. When they regrouped, he noticed Miss Grace watching from a distant hill, arms folded. She didn't say a word, but she nodded once. It was the first time he felt like a real soldier. The worst came on the night of day 2. A thunderstorm rolled in unexpectedly, lightning slicing across the sky like artillery fire. Rain fell in cold sheets. The terrain turned to sludge. The instructors issued new orders: move camp and continue march. No delays, no protection. As the storm howled, recruits moved like shadows through the trees, soaked to the bone and shivering. Several fell behind. Morale cracked, tempers flared. One recruit, Sullivan, cursed the exercise, threw down his pack, and screamed into the storm. Ethan approached him, calm despite the chaos. "I get it," he said, "but if you quit now, you'll never outrun it. The moment, the shame, you'll remember it every time someone calls you soldier." Sullivan's jaw trembled, not from cold, from conflict. Then he picked up his pack and fell back in line. When dawn broke on day 3, no one had slept. Most were too wet, too cold, too exhausted to think clearly. They reached the final checkpoint, an old, abandoned outpost from WWII. The drill sergeants ordered a perimeter setup and issued one final command: hold until relieved. They had to simulate holding the position for 6 hours, defending against fake assaults, managing resources, coordinating patrols. And that's when it happened. A real injury, a tree branch, soaked and heavy, snapped during a patrol. It struck down on recruit Jenkins, fracturing his collarbone and pinning him to the muddy slope. Chaos erupted. Radios crackled. Medics were called. The instructors tried to get there, but the terrain was too steep for immediate access. Ethan saw it happen, and before anyone else moved, he was already crawling through the mud. The slope was slick, dangerous. One wrong move and he'd fall. But he didn't care. He made it to Jenkins, checked his pulse, stabilized his head, and started digging the branch out. Then, without thinking twice, he braced his body under Jenkins and lifted. With waterlogged boots slipping, pack still on his back, Ethan hoisted Jenkins upward, step by grueling step. He didn't stop. Not when his shoulders screamed. Not when his knees gave out. Not when his vision blurred. He just moved. The entire camp watched as he carried Jenkins all the way to the outpost, where the instructors and medics finally took over, and standing at the gate of the outpost, soaked in rain, was Miss Grace. She didn't say anything. She walked over, looked at him, really looked at him. Then she spoke, voice low. "That's what a call sign is made of," she said. "Not names, not bloodlines, actions." And for the first time in his life, Ethan Breyer felt like a soldier. Not a recruit, not a legacy, a soldier. When the final horn sounded, and the instructors declared the exercise complete, half the recruits wept from exhaustion. The other half simply sat in the mud, too drained to move. Ethan stood there, chest heaving, soaked and trembling. He looked toward Miss Grace, and she saluted him, a single, solemn motion. He returned it, not out of pride, but out of gratitude, because he knew that the fire had come, and he had walked through it. The call sign ceremony wind at Fort Breyer always changed after Hell's March. It wasn't just the weather, though. The mornings felt sharper, and the nights fell quicker. But something deeper, something that moved through the bones of every recruit who had survived the ordeal, the fire, the rain, the weight of one another's lives pressed into their backs. It all left an invisible brand. They still wore the same uniforms, walked the same gravel paths, stood in the same chow lines. But everything was different now. There was a silence among them that was no longer awkward. It was bonded, earned. When they looked at each other now, it wasn't with competition. It was with understanding. And when they looked at Ethan Breyer, they saw someone who had crossed over. He didn't walk like the cocky, careless son of a colonel anymore. He didn't strut or crack jokes to fill silence. He moved with purpose, listened more than he spoke, ate slower, slept lighter. There was a rhythm in him now, a soldier's rhythm, carved through mud and pain and the weight of a wounded man slung across his shoulders. The instructors noticed, the recruits followed, and Miss Grace, though she never said it aloud, had already marked him in her mind. But before any transformation could be officially sealed, there was one tradition left. The call sign ceremony. It wasn't part of the Army's formal regulation. You wouldn't find it in any field manual or government memo. It was an old custom passed down in silence through generations of soldiers who believed that true warriors deserved more than numbers or rank. They deserved identity, earned identity. The ceremony was always held at dusk, 3 weeks after Hell's March. Long enough for wounds to scab over, but not long enough to forget where they came from. The location was always the same, a clearing near the edge of the woods behind the old barracks, where a fire pit sat beneath the open sky. No floodlights, no cameras, just firelight, stars, and stories. That evening, 40 recruits stood in a loose circle round the pit, their boots planted firmly, their hearts uncertain. Most didn't know if they'd be chosen. Call signs weren't given to everyone. Only those whose actions had spoken louder than their ambitions. Only those who had proven they could be counted on when it mattered most. General Thompson stood by the fire. His presence was like iron still, solid and undeniable. Miss Grace stood at his side, her hands clasped behind her back, eyes scanning the group not for flaws, but for fire. There were other officers present too, some from command, others veterans who'd returned just for this. Each one had a call sign of their own, whispered like legends, one by one. The names were called, not all 40, only 10. Each stepped forward, their name called by the general, their call sign presented by someone who had witnessed their defining act. It was always symbolic, never random. One recruit who had defended a broken perimeter with nothing but a dull entrenching tool was named Stonewall. Another, who'd navigated the entire squad back to base using only a damaged compass, and Starlight, was called North. Ethan stood in the back, not expecting his name. Not because he didn't believe in what he had done, but because he had stopped measuring his worth by recognition. For the first time, he didn't need applause. To feel whole, he didn't need someone to tell him he mattered. He'd already heard that in Miss Grace's quiet salute and seen it in the way Sullivan looked at him now with respect that couldn't be bought. Then, it happened. Private First Class Ethan Breyer. The general's voice boomed through the clearing. Ethan felt every head turned toward him. He stepped forward slowly, boots crunching against dry pine needles. The firelight cast tall shadows across his face, and the warmth of the blaze did little to soothe the cold in his chest. He didn't know what to expect, but then Miss Grace stepped forward, and everything else disappeared. She held a small, burnished plaque in her hand. No medals, no ribbons, just a single engraved nameplate. She looked him in the eyes. During Hell's March, this soldier carried another man up a slope that had broken to platoons before him. He didn't do it for praise. He didn't do it for points. He did it because it was the only right thing left to do. In that moment, he didn't ask who was watching. He didn't ask if he'd be rewarded. He just moved. And that's what makes a soldier unbreakable. The fire cracked. The trees rustled. Ethan held his breath. Miss Grace lifted the nameplate. "From this day forward," she said, her voice low and powerful, "you will answer to the call sign, Atlas." A ripple moved through the recruits. Atlas, the name of the Titan who held up the world. Ethan's throat tightened, not from pride, from understanding. Because he knew the weight now. The weight of carrying someone else's life, of holding others together when everything is falling apart, of bearing the burden without demanding to be seen. Miss Grace handed him the plaque. Then, breaking protocol for the first time that night, she extended her hand. He took it. Her grip was strong, calloused, real. The recruits saluted. The fire roared, and in that moment, Ethan Breyer ceased to exist. Atlas was born. Later that night, as the fire died and the recruits drifted back to the barracks in small groups, Ethan remained behind. He sat by the coals, the plaque in his lap, tracing the letters with a gloved finger. His hands were still raw, his body still sore. But something in him had settled. Not peace, not comfort, but clarity. He wasn't done growing. This wasn't the end. He had just been found. Behind him, a quiet footstep. He turned to see Miss Grace. "You earned it," she said softly. He nodded. "Only because of what I saw in you." She didn't smile, but her eyes shone with something brighter than approval. "Good. Then maybe one day, you'll understand what my call sign means too." And with that, she turned and walked away, her silhouette disappearing into the trees like a whisper from the past. And Ethan sat in the dark, watching the smoke rise, ready for whatever came next. Because now, he carried more than a name. He carried a legacy, his own. Scars that built the warrior. Frost had just begun to kiss the grass. On the northern edge of Fort Breyer, when Atlas no longer just Ethan Breyer stood alone, in front of the outdoor training range, staring across the open field where wooden targets swayed gently in the breeze. It had been 2 weeks since the call sign ceremony, and life had not slowed down for a second. The drills had intensified, and the expectations had silently shifted. Those who had earned names were now under closer scrutiny, not because they were favored, but because now the weight of example rested squarely on their shoulders. Atlas had felt that change almost immediately. Every time a recruit stumbled during ruck march formation, eyes would flick toward him, searching for a cue. Should they help, wait, shout? Whenever an instructor handed out a complicated field exercise, everyone paused just half a second longer, waiting to see if Atlas moved first. He had become more than a fellow trainee. He was now a symbol of what was possible when fire was faced. Head dash on. But leadership was not a medal you wore. It was a silence you carried. And some days, the silence was heavier than the 80-pound pack on his back. This particular morning, he wasn't scheduled for training. He had finished his required hours, completed his evaluations, and earned a half-day. Yet here he stood, staring across a line of dented steel targets, with a rifle slung over his shoulder and a restless feeling in his chest that no rest could ease. Behind him, gravel crunched. Miss Grace. She never made a sound unless she wanted to. And today, she wanted to. "You aiming to outshoot the ghosts this morning?" she asked, stepping beside him with that calm, composed energy that never wavered. Atlas didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the field. "Can't shake it, ma'am. I feel like I'm supposed to be doing more." She was quiet for a moment. "Let me guess. You've started to think that earning the name means earning every breath that comes after it." He finally turned toward her, brow furrowed. "Shouldn't it?" Miss Grace didn't answer right away. Instead, she took the rifle off his shoulder, checked the chamber, and reset the safety with casual elegance. Then she leaned it against the bench and crossed her arms. "Come with me," she said. They walked in silence for nearly 10 minutes, leaving behind the training field, heading into the old section of Fort Breyer, the part no one used anymore. Rusted chain-link fences, crumbling concrete, overgrown trails, and faded murals that once celebrated wars long forgotten. Miss Gray stopped in front of a small, weathered building. No signs, just a steel door. She pulled out a key, unlocked it, and pushed it open. Inside, the air was musty but still. The room was filled with storage crates, some dating back decades. But what stood out were the plaques on the walls, dozens of them, all black wood, engraved with names, dates, and call signs. Atlas moved slowly, scanning the names. Some were simple: Echo, Sandstorm, Fox. Others were haunting: Gravidigger, Mother, Reaper. These, Miss Gray said, are not decorations. They're memories. They're reminders. Every name on this wall belonged to someone who earned it the same way you did through fire. Some of them didn't survive long enough to carry their name past the battlefield. Others came home and still carry it in the shadows of their dreams. Atlas paused at a plaque near the top. It read: Winters, Grace, Phoenix, Kandahar, Helmand, Marya, Fallujah, Warrant Officer, Recon, Forward Operator, Combat Medic. He turned slowly toward her, eyes wide. "You were all of this?" She walked over and gently touched the edge of the plaque. "I was broken in all of this," she said. "Burned, cut, shot, left behind more than once. I earned the name Phoenix not because I was fearless, but because I kept rising, even when it made no sense, even when all I wanted was to stay down and let the silence win." There was no pride in her voice, no bravado, just honesty, raw and unshakable. "I was 24 the first time I lost someone under my watch. 26 when I carried a kid I had trained for 6 months, his chest full of shrapnel, half a mile through open ground. I still dream about the way his eyes looked, asking me if it was going to hurt. I told him no. I lied." Her voice cracked, just slightly, not weakness, memory. "I was 29 when I volunteered for the last op. My superiors begged me not to go, said I had nothing left to prove. But I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just couldn't leave it unfinished." Atlas listened, heart heavy, eyes fixed on hers. "What happened?" She rolled up her left sleeve. Long jagged scars, twisted, violent, deep, ran from her bicep to her wrist. She didn't hide them, didn't flinch. "Ambush, homemade explosives. Secondary detonator took out half our team. I was lucky and broken. But when they pulled me out of the rubble, I was still holding the radio, still calling for air support, still breathing." She let the sleeve fall. "They offered me retirement, full honors, a desk. But I came here instead, because someone needs to remind the next generation that leadership isn't about being the loudest or the strongest. It's about knowing the weight of every scar and choosing to stand anyway." Atlas was silent, not because he didn't know what to say, but because for the first time, he understood that the call sign Phoenix wasn't just about survival. It was about choosing resurrection over and over, no matter the cost. "So," she said, stepping back and motioning to the wall, "that weight you're feeling, that sense that you're not doing enough, that's the weight of legacy. Atlas, it's supposed to feel heavy, because you're not carrying just your past. You're carrying hope for the ones who will come after you. And that doesn't mean sacrificing yourself every second of every day. It means being present, strong, ready, and unafraid to rest when the fire dims." He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the plaque that bore her name. "I want to be worthy of this, not just once, always." She smiled, the first full smile he had seen from her since the day he arrived. "Then you already are." And just like that, she turned and walked back out into the fading afternoon light, leaving him in a room filled with ghosts, fire, and the undeniable truth of who she really was. Atlas looked at the wall again, and this time, he saw not just plaques. He saw an inheritance, not of blood but of fire, scars, and strength. And he made himself a promise. He would carry it, not perfectly, but with honor. The legacy lives on. Final week of training at Fort Breyer felt like the slow unwinding of a long-held breath. The sky seemed brighter somehow, the dirt softer beneath their boots, and the tension, that had once coiled inside every recruit now hung loosely, like a memory no one wanted to forget. For many, it was a countdown, just a few more days until they would graduate, receive their orders, and move on to the next phase of their lives as soldiers. But for Atlas, the name he now wore like armor, the final week wasn't about the future. It was about reflection, about honoring what had been endured, what had been learned, and what would never be the same again. Each morning still began with formation, but there was no shouting now. The instructors walked among the ranks with pride, rather than sharp correction. Miss Grace stood further back these days, more like a sentinel than a trainer, watching, measuring, perhaps even preparing herself to let go of the batch she had helped mold. Her posture was as upright as ever, but even Atlas could see it, the slight stillness in her eyes, the kind of stillness that only came when a torch had burned for too long and was finally being passed forward. One afternoon, as the sun leaned low across the parade grounds and cast long golden stripes across the field, the recruits were dismissed early. Officially, it was for uniform checks and final paperwork. Unofficially, it was a moment for breath, and Atlas took his alone out by the overlook behind the weapons depot, where the valley spread wide like an ocean of earth and wind. It was a place of quiet, untouched by boot prints and rarely visited except by those who needed to think. He sat on the edge of a boulder, hands folded in his lap, that old nameplate Atlas resting beside him. He didn't look at it. He didn't have to. It had already become part of his heartbeat. And now, for the first time, he understood what it meant to carry something greater than oneself, not for recognition, but for responsibility. That name wasn't a reward. It was a reminder. Behind him, the familiar sound of deliberate, measured footsteps. "Miss Grace, you always sit in the same place when you're thinking," she said, stepping beside the rock without needing an invitation. Atlas smiled faintly. "It's quiet here. Too quiet for some. Just quiet enough for me." She studied him for a moment. Then she sat beside him, her hands resting over her knees. She wore no rank on her jacket today. No visible scars. Just Grace Winters, the woman who had taught him more through silence than anyone had with words. "The next chapter's coming for you," she said. "Orders will arrive soon. New base, new mission, new brothers and sisters to stand beside. And you'll carry all of this with you." He nodded. "I know. That's what scares me." She glanced at him. "Scares you? Not the missions, not the enemy. What scares me is losing what this place gave me, forgetting the lessons, letting the noise of the world drown out the clarity I found here." Miss Grace was quiet for a while. The wind danced through the grass below. "Then remember this," she said finally. "Clarity is not a place. It's a decision. It's not something you lose because you leave. It's something you forget to carry." He looked at her, truly. Looked. Her face was calm, strong, and the lines of time and fire had softened rather than hardened her. But there was something else in her eyes, a depth of farewell. "You're leaving, aren't you?" he asked. She didn't deny it. "My time here's done," she said. "I stayed longer than I intended. But something told me this class, this year, was worth the extra time." And it was. He felt something catch in his throat, not grief, not fear, just the weight of gratitude so immense that words felt too small to carry it. "I don't know how to thank you. You already have," she replied. "By becoming what you were always meant to be." A pause. "There's something I want to give you," she added, reaching into her jacket pocket. She pulled out a small, folded square of worn fabric, a patch, faded, stitched with careful precision. It was the phoenix wings spread, fire curling. Around it, claws gripping nothing but air. "My first call sign patch," she said. "They don't issue them anymore. Too many names, too little fabric. But this one survived." She placed it in his hand. "It belongs to the next fire bearer." Atlas held the patch like it was a relic, sacred. He didn't speak. He simply nodded, jaw tight, heart pounding. As the sun slipped behind the distant hills and shadows stretched longer, they stood together in silence. No salutes, no ranks. Just two warriors, one who had risen from ashes, and one who had learned how to carry the world without letting it crush him. That night, at the graduation ceremony, the recruits stood tall. Flags fluttered. Families watched. Photos were taken. Medals were pinned. But the moment that would never be captured in any frame came just before the final dismissal. General Thompson took the stage and scanned the crowd of now soldiers. "There are many kinds of courage," he said, "some loud, some visible, but the kind that changes the world is often the quietest, the kind that stands back up after breaking, that carries others without applause, that bears scars not as shame, but as truth." Then he turned toward the back row. "Private First Class Ethan Breyer, call sign. Atlas, step forward." Atlas stepped out, heart steady. General Thompson looked down at him with the pride of a man who had seen legends born and reborn. "You represent the kind of soldier this world needs more of. And if you remember nothing else from this place, remember this: courage is not the absence of pain, it's the decision to carry it anyway." He extended his hand. Atlas shook it, and in the front row, dressed in civilian clothes, Grace Winters watched, a quiet smile on her lips. No longer in uniform, no longer on duty, but forever part of the legacy. Because some names don't fade when the uniform comes off. Some names are etched into the souls of those they inspire, and long after the ceremony ended, long after the lights were dimmed and the soldiers sent off to their new lives, the legend of Phoenix and Atlas lived on. In whispers around campfires, in stories told by rookies hoping to one day earn a name. In scars worn with pride. And in a patch carefully sewn onto the inside of a soldier's jacket wear. Fire met steel, and the burden became a legacy.